We're very fortunate to have some esteemed panelists today to help us think through and understand what TV Everywhere means from both the network and service provider perspectives. I know that beyond that wall, there's an OTT discussion. We'll do our best to focus on TV Everywhere. But in many ways, it's apropos in that I'll consider that the paywall, and thank all of you for being paying subscribers here inside of our TV Everywhere conference. I'd like to begin by asking each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their company. We'll ask a few questions, generate some discussion, and then leave about 10 minutes at the end for your questions. So with that in mind, let me turn to my right. Brick.
My name is Brick Eksten. I'm the president of Digital Rapids. We are a provider of encoding, transcoding, and streaming solutions. We also do a lot of transformation products, mostly in the B2B, typically in studios, cable, and event-based solutions.
I'm Andrew Grant. I work for Akamai Technologies. Among other things, we are the largest content delivery network in the world, and we work very closely with both the cable partners in the world as network partners, as well as doing the vast majority of delivery of premium content over the internet.
Hi, I'm Louisa Shipnuck. I have marketing and strategy responsibilities for a new business group within Verizon called Digital Media Services. And we are specifically within the wholesale group, which means we'll be agnostic to anyone who is interested in delivering and doing content services for premium content. And so Fios, who I think many of you, of course, consider when you think of Verizon, as well as our wireless properties, will in fact be customers of ours. But we'll also work with regional MSOs. We'll also work with over-the-top providers. So it's great to be here today. Thank you so much.
And I'm Steve Christian. I run the marketing team at Verimatrix. And Verimatrix is in the business of protecting video streams across multi-network and multi-screen environments. I think everyone knows what multi-screen environment looks like, but multi-network may require a little bit more explanation. We see really many of the deployments around the world, especially what you might call within the pay TV fence, being a combination of different technologies. And what we strive to do is to provide coherent security strategies that enable you to make money off all of the different delivery endpoints and all the different kind of consumer devices that are being used, from the set-top box to a tablet to a phone.
All right, thank you. I think, as you'll agree, we have the right folks here for this discussion. So let's kick it off. I'd like to begin at the beginning and ask, in particular, the panelists, what are, in fact, the distribution goals of the service providers? And I think we have, in many ways, two perfect bookends for that conversation. Verizon's VDMS, which is, keep me honest, a purpose-built, rich media, fairly recent CDN-like package of services from a service provider. And Akamai, which all but created the category, wrote the original algorithm, and helped us all serve faster. So I'd like to begin with Louisa and then ask Andrew to follow. What are, in fact, some of the key distribution goals these days for service providers?
Right. Well, Verizon obviously is a multifaceted organization, and if you're considering Fios or you're thinking wireless, obviously it's about increasing customer satisfaction, it's about increasing loyalty, it's reducing churn, it's increasing ARPU, all of those things. The side of the business that I'm on is really about creating a wholesale business to support and ignite digital media. And so much of the environment to date has really been legacy, not necessarily media purpose-built, and that's what we're really tackling. There are two parts of our business, really, within Verizon Digital Media Services. And again, we will serve and support ecosystem partners and, in fact, competitors. That's the benefit of being part of wholesale. The first part of our end-to-end solution is really content services. It's a highly fragmented, fairly chaotic part of the service environment. And studios, networks, and content owners are really being crushed under the complexity of the workflows that they have to now serve for digital media, the ways that they need to get their content out to their customers, their digital retail partners, as well as to end users when they go direct. So we are, in fact, creating an automated digital media utility that will handle anything from ingestion, transcode, encode, all the way to the wholesale delivery to the retail partner. The next thing we're really doing is working on a media purpose-built unicast environment so that individuals and We all use media through a variety of connected devices, and that is only getting greater and more explosive in the couple of years ahead. The question is not if the volume of content will double or triple. The only question is when. Is it 2 months? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? We really need to have the network and the environment, the infrastructure that will, in fact, keep pace with what consumers require. So we're in the process of building a new way to treat and handle and care for media as it goes all the way to the end user. So we talk about this as a digital media utility, and it is really there for over-the-top enablement. Again, we'll serve Fios and its over-the-top developments, but we'll also provide it to any retailer that has a consumer relationship and wants to serve premium media, as well as to the content owners and through the networks behind the scenes doing the content services, as well as their end-user, direct-to-user kinds of initiatives. So it's the purpose-built, end-to-end solution digital media utility that we're really bringing to the fore. And again, that's separate. Our goals are separate because it's around automation, integration, and scale versus where Fios is, for example, which is around the consumer relationship and the strengthening of it.
So when I think about the distribution goals for the cable business as it relates to TV everywhere, one of the great images I saw in the last few weeks was this shot of a guy with a prosthetic arm who had carved out a place to put his iPhone into his forearm so that he could both hold something with the prosthesis and then also be able to text and communicate in the most sort of basic and emotional way that these devices sort of drive us to socialize. And so when I think about that in the context of a cable business, which some might argue has some shared qualities with a prosthetic arm, I think about it really that the cable guys are fundamentally oriented around meeting the deep and unquestionable consumer demand for all the time, anywhere content consumption on the devices that mean so much to them, right? So, well, I think Louisa, totally astutely articulated the idea that this is really fundamentally about reducing churn and ARPU. It's also being able to deliver a much more innovative and potentially, that's a function of using an IP backbone, but a much more innovative and easy to provision service offering for consumers to meet those expectations so that they can still have that delightful content experience. I think the other piece there, which, I think there's some overlap. Verizon's one of our biggest partners as well as, we're working in similar spaces in some of the space, is that there's an increased reliance on the managed network providers to use the network to resolve some of this sort of ever-burgeoning complexity of a constantly expanding device landscape. And being able to do that in a way that can be very pointedly provisioned on almost a per-asset basis to make sure they meet the contractual obligations that they have with the content providers, but also functionally are not having to go and invest CapEx outside of the core scope of the CapEx investments that they make, particular to building out the fiber backbone that, for example, Comcast has made very public about their investment there. So I think that there's sort of there's a dueling purposes. I need to meet that emotional connection so that the value of my subscription continues to evolve in the mind of me as a consumer. But then I also want to make sure that I'm relying on both the core network that I've developed myself as a service provider, but also third parties who have other network functionality to be able to use the network to resolve some of this complexity over time.
Oh, that's an incredible example, Andrew, of commitment in that. So let's explore a bit how successful or not the network is in meeting these goals. Many of these strategies are reactionary, if you will, responses to consumer electronics, to new behaviors, and new commitment levels to activities that didn't exist even 5 years ago. So I'd like to begin exploring.
He already had the prosthesis.
I'd like to explore that. Arguably, at the root of TV Everywhere is an effort to, if you will, curb bad internet behaviors and enforce and support good linear behaviors, for lack of another phrase. So I'd like to ask in particular, start with Steve, TV Everywhere, fundamentally, are the drivers piracy or the paywall?
Well, I guess piracy is, or loss of revenue, is always the backdrop of any kind of service provision, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't like to emphasize that because I think it starts off on a sort of very negative note. I think the trends that we're seeing is that a move to offer multi-screen and multi-network services, as I outlined initially, is both a defensive strategy and an offensive strategy. And although many people think about just the defensive approach to try and head off the cherry picking of other devices and other services by the Xbox in the living room or something like that. I also like to think about the offensive strategy that enables the distribution of assets from a service provider, not only within the home of their subscribers to multiple screens within the home, but also to places that their subscribers visit, maybe the local Starbucks or something like that, maybe a hotel when they're going away from a holiday, maybe the holiday house or the rented house or something like that, potentially on a worldwide basis. And I think that's something we don't necessarily see looking from the US perspective, is the potential for service delivery way outside of the geographic footprint of the traditional MSO or telco provider. And I think that where we're operating and where we're seeing most ambitious kind of rollout of this kind of generalization of TV everywhere is in organizations around the world that have that kind of global perspective. They want to be the source of content, the aggregator of content, and the deliverer of content, not only within their own territory, but also to like-minded subscribers around the world. For instance, Arabic speakers, or delivery of Filipino soap operas to the huge diaspora of people who understand the language and understand the culture around the world, and that represents a huge subscriber base and an upsell of their service offering that goes way beyond just the defensive approach that you might imagine, just occupying iPads and things like that with copies of live channels that you can otherwise get on your set-top box. So, just from a Verimatrix point of view, obviously what we've got to think about is not only the securing and authentication of devices and things like that within the home. Then we've got to think about how those devices can be portable outside of the home, how you can adopt the same kind of strategies whether the device is in the geographic territory or somewhere worldwide, and so sort of generalize the delivery mechanism and the security mechanisms that cope with all of these different kinds of networks in CDN, in managed network, outside of the CDN, in an unmanaged network, or totally on the other side of the world where there's no quality of service or quality of experience kind of management at all. Does that set the scene a little bit from our point of view?
It does, Steve. In fact, it's a great point in underscoring what we're really talking about here is primarily video content, and that is about the most expensive payload I think any carrier's network carries. If you think of content creation and the cost and the effort that goes into that, and you're right, it is portable, it is global. I'd like to segue and ask Brick, authentication, authorization, rights management, policy enforcement, these are very, very important things to the studios who originate the content, to the consumers and all those devices that they consume it on. Can you help us understand kind of what is involved in that value chain and how that supports some of these goals from, again, security, or I like the way Steve said it, loss of revenue, whether that's from legitimate or illegitimate means. Could you take us from the studio to the second screen?
Yeah, we can't really talk about the strategy without first talking about the dark corner of the room, which is piracy. It is the backdrop that starts all these conversations. It's what everybody almost exclusively starts with when they start talking about loss of revenue. It's because of the piracy. But piracy, in my mind, is about convenience and access. If you look at where we are today with TV everywhere and what's really driving TV everywhere, it's the consumer demand for a different kind of experience that's driving this. This isn't a coordinated effort from the inside out. It's a coordinated effort or a discoordinated effort from the outside in. The consumers are going out and buying these platforms and demanding that their content show up. And if you don't provide the content, they're going to find it somewhere. That's what the history of the internet tells us. And so, against that backdrop, the studios have to consider, this sort of plethora of different networks and services and offerings that are out there that they can position their content into. And they have to feel good about each and every one of them before they can release their content into them. They're sort of beyond the Me Too, I'm just going to throw my stuff up on YouTube and see what happens and look at the metrics kind of point of view. They're trying to be more proactive and more coordinated, and they're trying to actually make money with this. And so as they look across this, they're looking to the standards, and they're looking to the standards not only of the security of the content, but also the exchange of the content, to make sure that people are getting all the information they need to provision the content for these devices. And speaking to what Steve was saying, in some cases, especially outside of North America, they're concerned with the languages and all the different aspects of the content that they have. They have within their vaults these gold mines of opportunity. They have very complex organizational structures around their media, and they want to feel good that when they hand it off to somebody, that it's being taken care of, that the right audio, the right video, the right things are getting out to the end user. So from our perspective, the key in all of that is enabling each of the sort of technology consumers. As a technology company, each of the technology consumers has the right access point to manipulating that content in a way that allows the studios to feel good about it. And that all comes down to standards and understanding of workflow and understanding of the provisioning requirements and all those kinds of things. They all got to tie together around these the standards and the understanding that the core content is going to get taken care of throughout the network. So it starts at the studio. They've got, the studios want to feel good that when they put out this content, that the experience isn't going to be disrupted by bad playback on a particular device, or it's not showing up on the network the way it should, because it makes them look bad. Ultimately, when you're looking at some content on your phone, the decision you make is not about Akamai or Verizon or something like that. You go, oh, Warner Brothers, right? You screwed this up. And it has nothing to do with Warner Brothers. So, the studios have to feel good about, who they're feeding this content into, and that everybody is taking their role and responsibility along the way. So it starts at the studios. They have to feel good about the standards, the two biggest initiatives being Dash and Ultraviolet at this point. That's really created a rallying point for not only for them, but the rest of the over-the-top ecosystem as well. Who are, the television providers and phone providers and things like that, are all trying to tie together value add to their particular devices in this experience that they support these standards. So these standards provide the rallying point. It gives the studios the ability to focus on, a couple of particular deliverables and really open up a conversation, because prior to having the standards, people didn't know how to discuss exchanging the content. What does it mean? Am I responsible for encoding? Are you responsible for encoding it? And so forth down the line. From a consumer's perspective, or from the provider's perspective, the standards give them a way of looking at the content and understanding, the beginning stages of their workflow, because it's inside of their facility that they have to start thinking about these value-added services that they want to attach to it. Whether they're talking about fingerprinting or watermarking or any of these things, they have to understand that attaching these services and access control and all these touch points to this, they have to understand what they're starting with, so that they understand when they deliver it that they're delivering the right total experience and that it's going to work. The CE companies who, largely you don't really think about the CE companies as being part of this, but the CE companies absolutely have to adhere to the standards, so that when the consumer goes out to Best Buy and they buy that device, and they bring it home within their walled garden or outside their walled garden, or however they're going to access it, that the content that they're clicking on is actually going to play, and they're going to have a good experience. Disregarding the network for a second, they want to know that that device is able to do it. And so we're seeing these initiatives inside of Hollywood where topics like Ultraviolet are getting a lot of play and a lot of commitment from inside of the studios. On the live side, you're seeing a lot of commitment around standards like Dash. And it's not because these are intrinsically new or misunderstood technologies. It's just about they need something common to talk about to help drive the opportunity of the ecosystem to its natural conclusion, which is to make sure that this content actually can play back on all these devices, and that all the touch points that are involved, whether it's security or access control or network provisioning or metering, monitoring, whatever you're going to do, all works along the way. So.
And I think, just to add to that, we started this conversation by talking about piracy versus the paywall. But I also think, in addition to defraying the piracy risk, there are also tremendous issues of substitution from new MVPDs themselves. So I think we're going to see a flourishing the next year or two of folks aggregating content and reselling it in new and different ways. So I think there's a substitution risk. Additionally, 50% of the media and entertainment business is funded through advertising, and we haven't figured out the parity between channels in advertising. You have a seventh or an eighth of the ad load in new channels versus what we see typically in broadcast. And these are things that are very near and dear to the content owner's heart, because they have to generate revenue in any number of ways. Authenticated or conditional access content is clearly one way, but it's only one way. And they haven't figured out or cared for how to, none of us really have, how to translate the algebra so that the revenue stays the same, the profit stays the same, no matter where the content is accessed. So I think in addition to piracy, there are going to be new competitors coming onto the scene, which certainly will affect companies like Verizon, but will affect everybody who currently has a subscriber base. And then next, we have to really do more experimentation around advertising. We have to figure out the ad loads. We have to figure out how to get parity of CPMs if we're going to introduce new formats of advertising. And lots of people have been working on that for quite some time. We need to show that there's a compelling way to continue engagement, to create achievement of marketing goals, all of those things. So piracy is certainly a worthy conversation, but I don't think it's the only risk, clearly, for the purveyors of TV everywhere.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I mean, part of what, that proliferation of devices that, you consistently sort of read this relative to the challenges that some of these audience measurement companies have had around what they perceive as the fragmentation of consumer behavior as you move to more and more of these IP endpoints. If you think about TV everywhere functionally as an authentication schema, they know that that endpoint is mine, right? And they have a significantly rich level of demographic data about me, and they have an OSS-BSS relationship where I'm paying them a certain sum of money. I have a payment relationship with my system provider as well. The opportunity for addressable advertising is really the elephant in the room when it comes to these conversations that are more technical in orientation around TV everywhere, or oriented around piracy versus managed service paywall. I think that the level of rich behavioral data that's unique to the prosthetic arm, right, to the way that I move about a particular neighborhood, the way that I move about my home, the way that my behavior within the context of a particular episode of content changes as I move from device to device or network to network, that is the vast untapped pool of very, very rich and very, very big data that is suddenly going to make itself present and available to advertisers in a way that a fixed set-top box in the household that never moves has never, an opportunity that's never presented. And so when we think about this, from our perspective, a lot of it has to do with the idea that if you can leverage a lot of these standards to be able to unify the presentation of those video assets to these multiple devices, tune that, make the supply chain more efficient, then you start to have the adoption that is requisite for you to be able to really make interesting moves and material experiments around addressing this advertising in a highly personalized way across devices as a system operator. And I think that coupled with the fact that you have to sort of advance the way that you've architected your sales organization to sell in a non-linear way and make sure that you have the ad avails, all of this other sort of mechanics of this, that's the real massive opportunity on the table. So if you think about it exclusively as I'm trying to avoid churn, I don't know, it might be that I'm actually trying to be able to, by an order of magnitude, move up both the relevance of the advertising to me as a consumer who accepts that ads are requisite, but also be able to go and make that much more personalized at scale, which is sort of a technical challenge more than anything else.
I'm always a bit shocked that we come around to advertising as the only way to provide an upside in this kind of world, actually. It's certainly one possibility, but in a world where you're no longer limited by the fixed bandwidth of a cable distribution system, where and you know that the history of, for instance, cable LSOs is that content owners are always knocking on the door. Please spare up that extra few megahertz so I can get my channel in, right? So there's a as you get more efficient use of the bandwidth and so on and so forth, more channels appear, but there's always been some kind of finite limit, 500 channels or whatever. Now you have an IP distribution strategy across these multiple screens where you've got potentially an infinite variety of channels. As my examples of Arabic content or Filipino soap operas or cricket or something like that, right? They start to appear as extra incremental charges, as extra levels of a service relationship, I think. And that to me seems like a very much more obvious way to add value, to monetize, to increase the ARPU of a very go-ahead service provider than just thinking defensively and how do I just attack. I mean, advertising will have a role, I'm sure, and as you say, you're gathering more data on people and devices become more personal. Potentially that gives you an opportunity to be more revealing about what you might want to see on that device as an advertising. But it's just the sheer potential to up the number of transactions and up the business relationship and up the engagement, because you've got so much more material that's available that can be delivered in a very personalized and very comprehensive manner. So.
And I would say that it's based on much of that same intelligence that you were talking about, Andrew. What I would refer to what you're talking about is micro-merchandising, that each individual gets a bundle and maybe even pricing schemes and the requisite companion advertising that makes sense for him or her, and that there may even be a way in which to detect which individuals are in a house. Doesn't necessarily mean logging onto your television. There are lots of ways in which you can be authenticated. And it could be that each individual, even in a household, but certainly an individual on the go, can have their own experience, their own pricing scheme. Perhaps it might be a la carte in the future, who knows? In other words, I think that, and we sit in an agnostic area of the business where we will prepare and care for whatever the business model is. But I think that micro-merchandising, just like hyper-targeted advertising, is built on the intelligence that underpins the system, and it's built on all facets of a user. Time sensitivity, behavioral analysis, recommendations, or maybe social attributes, whatever the case is, it's really then serving them the right recommendations and the right bundles and the right advertising, the right promotions that make sense for him or her. Much more individualized, and now the network, because of Unicast, is preparing for that, and I think it's an and, it's not either or, it's and, in my view.
If I could, this has been an excellent part of the discussion. I want to borrow a phrase that I think all of you used, which was endpoints. And that's ultimately what all these IP devices are for. What I think all of you eloquently described are, these are endpoints possibly for, starting with Brick, stealing content, paying for content, advertising as a replacement to subscription or other types of business models, or even new business models that have not yet been created, as Louisa suggested. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, if I can, a rough categorization of these devices. Arguably, Apple and Android have done a very good job of working with and designing for networks. Their success in many ways relies upon integration, whether it's from a pure billing standpoint or a technological standpoint, with carriers, in particular mobile devices, which many of these second screens are. But there are another category of devices which, by their very nature, could provide for an over-the-top experience or a TV everywhere experience. Connected TVs and gaming stations come to mind. I'd like to ask the panelists their thoughts on TV everywhere, which I might submit as a thesis. At first, carriers attempt to kind of control the behavior, put the internet through the middle. One of my favorite phrases from Virgin Media as to their answer to OTT. But let's be realistic. These devices are proliferating at a very fast rate. Consumer electronics are about finding hits and cycling through those hits as quickly as possible. It would be nearly impossible to keep up with all of that. So, panelists, thoughts on these others? Connected TVs, gaming stations, opportunities or threats for the TV everywhere environment?
It's all got to be part and parcel of the same picture. I feel anyway. Connected TVs are a natural, can easily be seen, for instance, as a natural second room, third room kind of device that doesn't require a set-top box. It reduces the need for capex, for instance, for a typical cable operator, or and enables easy distribution strategy of at least basic TV to those kinds of devices. It's a natural complement to what's going on in the living room, for instance. Tablet devices, mobile devices, people are in love with them. I fell in love with my iPad as a TV device the first time I ever picked it up, and in the morning when they were launched, right? I thought, wow, that's an incredible thing. And then games consoles. Well, they were interesting targets right from the outset because they were almost universally connected because of the paradigm. They didn't conflict with the main room TV necessarily. They were usually in a second room, a den or something like that. And they have phenomenal graphics capabilities, at least majority of them. So they are they are natural endpoints. They are natural endpoints, to use the phrase we've come up with, for video services, and I think incremental, and I guess given the different characteristics of the people who might be using those kinds of things, different demographics, it might be seen that you'd end up with different types of content and different business models naturally sort of falling out on those different kinds of devices. So,
I think it also, those devices fundamentally, I think last year when I was in Australia, seeing a pay TV operator substitute set-top boxes for the Xbox, Verizon making that announcement as well, and putting that to market. The other side here is that you have a couple of things. One, the interface is just vastly superior to that of a cable set-top box today, right? And Google TV, withstanding or notwithstanding, the idea that I could use a Connect interface to be able to scroll through blades and be able to go and select content, that changes my perception as a consumer of the content offering, right? And then the other side of that is that you also are subsequently able to go and deliver, as we saw, Anthony Zeiker's presentation yesterday, a mass array of value-added, highly contextual content to those devices, where the interface is really driving, a consumer diving into that content experience. That really reinforces the value of that subscription relationship in a meaningful way. Obviously, the economic question about the degree of control that a system operator versus a widget provider versus a CE manufacturer has over the consumer in that particular construct is still one that I think is fundamentally unanswered, or at least open. In North America, certainly, the cable guys would say that they own that subscriber relationship. The question of whether or not they then subsequently bear the burden of that innovation, given the fact that they no longer control or have spent $1 billion on set-top boxes, is one that sort of I think will be interesting to see resolved.
Is it an opportunity or is it a challenge? The people that are creating these devices, particularly the game consoles, have a vested interest in propagating their own content. They are the original over-the-top guys. They were generating hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue before people were really talking about over-the-top based on content that was delivered directly to these devices as a replacement for a set-top box. The content was different. In some cases it was video, in some cases it was games, but whatever. It's a network, it's an experience. Consumers latched onto it, and it generated tremendous amounts of revenue from it for these companies. These companies definitely see these boxes as their footprint and the way that they're going to attack the market. And you can take that and extrapolate it directly to the television side as well. Even though the TVs seem to be, on the surface, a little bit less powerful and a little bit less interactive than these game consoles, they are, the first interface that the consumer has to deal with, and they're becoming more powerful. And these consumer companies, the CE companies, are enabling them with newer technologies, and they're already building in a lot of, over-the-top capabilities through subscription directly into them. And really the challenge for the content, for the service provider is, how do I become part of that ecosystem, or how do I channel that ecosystem through my system so that I just don't become a network in that equation? And I think really it comes down to, you almost have to take a step back and say, what we really need these devices to do is to deal with these few standards, like the dashes and the Ds, the ultraviolets of the world. And we need for them to be able to deliver a rich, interactive experience, probably based around HTML5 or something like that, so that, it evens the playing field. And then you've got a chance. But until then, I would argue that it's a little bit of a challenge to think that you're going to, as a content provider, that you're going to do as good a job presenting on that device as the device manufacturer themselves, because they're going to build it right into the firmware.
So Brick, I'm going to sort of throw something just thought-provoking. I was listening to Andrew and yourself about the differences in those kinds of devices, particularly game consoles. Let's focus on game consoles. It suddenly struck me that one of the features of a game console is the wildly different and very passionately accepted, shall I say,
Pain.
passionate user group that uses a particular way of interacting, a Wii or a Kinect or something like that, and the wildly different user interface that would imply for search and navigation on a video service. And potentially, one of the things that you quite often hear about a TV everywhere strategy is you want the same experience on every device. And we started talking about standards, HTML5. Well, my PS3 is a terrible way to watch web content, right? It's just a terrible place to navigate the web. But it's a brilliant games console. So maybe you're right. Maybe there is a natural advantage of the people who are operating games console networks and have a huge knowledge and understanding of the way to best exploit those kinds of special user engagements and interfaces and different control mechanisms and things like that. Maybe they do have a natural environment. They can wall off that games environment as something that's always going to be separate and maybe more advanced than what you might call the TV everywhere, lowest common denominator things that's going to occur on other kinds of devices. Is that a thought?
But I think everybody is embracing the challenge and opportunity at exactly the same time. So Fios is working with Xbox, and they're doing that because we have the live linear rights that Xbox does. And Xbox has been doing VOD for a very long time, and they're the third largest VOD purveyor behind Time Warner Cable and Comcast. And most people don't know that, but they have been doing delivery of film for quite some time. But when it comes to live linear, that's a very, very different type of business relationship and content relationship. And so Fios is now embedded within Xbox, which is a different way of taking advantage of it, but doing so in partnership, using the advantage that both have, one business rights and consumer relationship, the other the technology. However, on the other side, you have Sony, who has announced publicly that they're doing an MVPD, where they will be involved with a variety of content, and they will take a different tact, and that will be using their usership to convert into probably a very, very different type of subscription that could be a substitution for those groups already having relationships on content. So I think there's a variety of ways that companies are taking different bets, and Verizon will be doing a number of things, not just the Xbox and the Fios relationship, but any number of other things to figure out what's going to win with the consumer. I think the disadvantage that game consoles have is that they have avid loyalists amongst their users, but they are not known as the entertainment center. They are not a head of household brand name. They're not the name that comes up. The gamer is the one who knows the console, and if he or she introduces it to the rest of the family, that's one thing. But I think if they are to truly displace others and become the central point of entertainment in the house, they have to go through rebranding, is my opinion.
Does Xbox version of Fios look the same and feel the same as Xbox on a set-top box, or
I haven't seen the lab, so I don't know actually how that's coming to pass. But is taking advantage, is my understanding of Connect, in which case it will be based on the Connect menu and all the swiping, and there will be common elements. There should be common elements with any over-the-top, your content availability, the coloring. But I believe that every device is using the best advantage of it. If you're on a tablet, you have to be able to swipe. If you're on Connect, it has to take advantage of the motion activation. So it's the best of with common themes. But again, I'm not with Fios and I haven't seen the lab, so I'll have to get back to you.
So it was an unfair question, but I thought I was.
It's very recent. I'll have to get back to you on it.
I think that when you start talking about these devices and whether or not they're viable as a brand within the home or as the go-to for watching and consuming entertainment, I think you have to consider that as a generational problem. That's a demographic. It's about the guys that are the avid gamers. Unfortunately, I'm one of them.
Unfortunately, why would you say that?
My wife doesn't like it. The guys that are the avid gamers are they're the technologically elite in the family. They're the consumers of this next generation of device and content. They're the ones that are setting the stage for how content gets consumed 3, 4, 5 years from now as they move into the majority demographic of money spending, of revenue generation.
Totally
and so the advantage that the incumbents have is that they've got contractual value and access to local content. Right. They've already brokered all the content rights. They have access to the local. Yeah, they've got great valuable data and content available there. The over-the-top, the CE play, where they're coming in, and delivering content, trying to deliver premium content on there, they're missing a key component about that, which is they know a little bit about that user from, the credit card and the name, but they can't tie together a bunch of other information. And I think it's going to take a collaboration between the two, especially on the television, because the television is itself, the connected television is a bridge between that 16 to 24 paying gamer, avid gamer, or in some cases 49 avid gamer, and the rest of the generational gap, which is everybody above that, which is looking at their television. You have to sort of bridge a technological gap, which is do they even know that stuff exists on their television? Because there's a lot of televisions out there today that are fully connected and have tons of capabilities inside of them. anybody that's buying a 3D TV is probably getting an over-the-top solution. They don't even know it, right? And what's more, they haven't brought a network connection up to it, so they can't take advantage of it. So, I think that it takes it's going to take some marketing to sort of drive that fact home. It's going to take some positioning by the local provider. It's going to take some rebranding and some generational sort of maturation, from the people that are using the game consoles today to sort of get everything on the same page. But still, you have to consider the challenge that, if you own content and you want to get it onto those devices, the first thing you need to do is understand that device, understand how to become a rich part of the ecosystem. Maybe you're doing that through a partner, through the Fios enablement. Maybe you're doing that through your own efforts, creating your own apps for these devices or whatever it is you're doing. But it's a serious part of your technological deployment that you sort of have to do it one way or another. You have to make those choices, and you're going to have to do them pretty soon, or else you're just going to miss the boat. There is a defensive opportunity. Establishing your brand as a viable brand inside that space is something you should be thinking about now. If you're not thinking about it, then someone else is going to do it for you. Right?
Total boon for the studios and the content owners and the networks. Anybody owning content right now is going to have a proliferation of places to sell it. And I think one of the challenges that the connected TV world has is they're trying to create their own aggregated points while selling real estate to other retailers like a Netflix. And so they're creating brand and channel conflicts within their own environment. Furthermore, they're creating confusion for the consumer who now on their same system has 20 choices. Consumers, I think, in the end, are going to end up with the retailer who provides to them the best, dedicated, high-quality, premium content experience that follows them throughout the day and across all their devices seamlessly, and across networks, and across borders. And borders, although, is very tricky with the rights issue, so maybe I'll put that aside for now. But across networks, across devices. And is that going to be Samsung's IPTV portal, or is it going to be a more established brand name like a Hulu or a Netflix, or is it going to be a legacy player, which might be a current MVPD? I don't know, but what I do think is for the next 2 years, it's going to be extremely chaotic for consumers as they try to figure out who gives them the best experience, which content to tap, where they want to allocate their wallet. And I do think legacy players have a lot of great experience with their content, with their consumer data mining, but they're also very, very good at micro billing, which is a lot of what we're talking about with micro merchandising and with new forms of ARPU and subscription uplift and with hyper-targeted advertising. So I do think legacy players have an advantage, certainly. And I do think all these new devices coming to the fore when they create their own aggregation point and when they enter into new real estate and rev share deals with other players like a Netflix or Hulu or Vudu or Roku or whomever, I just think it's going to be very confusing. And all the device proliferation and all of the SKU creation and all of the formats and files and transcode, encode, distribution, all of that just blows out the complexity in the environment, and it really creates a service provider that needs to come in with scale, with reliability, with quality, and I know that's a part that we're all here.
That's interesting, because that's exactly how the aggregators, the cable companies, the satellite companies have positioned their value in the last 20 years, I guess, right, or longer probably. So I definitely think that having trust, for having built trust with a consumer and getting their credit card information in their system in such a way that you can bill every month, and you say micro bill as well, right? The little extras, the incremental transactions, the added services, the added devices, things like that. That's a situation of power, and nobody should underestimate that. A confusion like Louisa's talking about of, well, I've got this service for this particular type of content, and I have to give this credit card number to these 10 different people, and keep all those kind of numbers juggled. And what happens if you lose your credit card, right? You've got 10 different places to. I mean, there's a reason why triple play and quad play became, important sort of tenets of faith in the industry, is that people wanted one bill from one supplier and to be able to manage everything on one page. And I think this is going to be true for the video industry in general. So even though there are disruptive forces out there, there's a lot of power in that one neck to twist, if you like, one place where you put your trust for a lot of the content that you're going to consume in the household. So.
And I think underlying this to some extent is also, as technologists, we tend to fail. Louisa and I both work for companies that try to resolve these sort of network level problems. I think oftentimes we fail to adequately weight the consumer's desire for a passive experience. Right? All this functional sort of innovation, we are often asked at Akamai the question about, to what degree can the internet accommodate the transition of all live linear feed into an all IP public internet environment, right? Which is a very complex question, not because you can't do the math, you can, right? But because so much of what exists in a unicast world is completely different from the fact that I have CNBC running in the background on the big screen for 3/4 of the day in my home. That those are two different patterns of behavior, and they're not necessarily adequate substitutes for one another. So when we think about what we're doing at the presentation layer to innovate around sort of how we interface, how we start to sort of coalesce this sort of nesting doll approach to rights partnership and billing relationships, we should probably temper some of that technical enthusiasm with the reality of the fact that consumers, sometimes they just like to have the TV running without having to do much.
Well, yeah, all that interactivity is just so they can sit down.
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah.
That's a
I'm
great
gonna find
point.
all this content. And I'm going to sit down.
Yeah, now I'm going to do nothing.
I hate to hit pause on this very relevant part of the discussion, but I do want to leave room for questions for audience. I, for one, am also going to leave this panel with some very wild images of texting with your forearm and navigating the programming grid like a shooter POV game, or hand waving on Connect.
It's the future, baby.
To come full circle, TV everywhere is a distinct strategy. It's public, it's a big bet that ranges all the way from the studios and the content originators through aggregators to the MVPDs, consumer electronics companies that have a bet on, in, or around it, and ultimately the consumers who will be passive or interactive or some combination of both to get what we want. So it's difficult to resist asking, is TV everywhere and OTT mutually exclusive? Are these binary? Is there a winner and therefore by definition a loser? So I'd like to ask each of our panelists their thoughts on that question briefly before we turn to the audience, and I guess I'll state it as this. Is OTT as inevitable as the internet? Were MVPDs just a bad use of syllables? Or conversely, does a body at rest tend to stay at rest? And laws of physics prevail, and we can't even get off the couch to cut the cord. So I'd like to hear your thoughts briefly on this and then open up to our audience.
By the way, I enjoyed that summation.
That was good, right?
Oh,
Can you define the frame of reference slightly? OTT meaning?
OTT meaning cord cutting, meaning stepping away from a subscription-based linear delivery model in business, or sticking with that, and MVPDs finding a way to provide internet or internet-like experiences and consumer satisfaction inside the paywall and that distribution methodology.
I'm pretty convinced that where consumers want information and entertainment services, there's going to be somebody who's going to find a way to deliver that in a paid form, right? To package it up, to aggregate it, to present it, and there's money to be made there. Just there has been in the past. I don't see the. I hate to be a sort of preserver of the status quo in some ways, but you can see that there's a demand for it. It doesn't seem to be going away because always hunting for the next clip that you want to watch is wildly different, as Andrew said. Just having a program running away in the background and just noticing it occasionally when something you want to watch comes on. It's a very different kind of usage paradigm, and those two things both exist. You've got to have somebody who's going to package up and present a service that will combine those two kinds of experiences together in a way that suits a paying public or a public who can actually foot the bill for it. So,
yeah, I think that I have a broader view of OTT, less that it's necessarily about subscription, but I think we'll see OTT with ad subsidies. I think we'll see it with subscription. I think we'll see new forms of bundling, and I think that will continue to metamorphose in the next 2 to 3 years quite dramatically. And I think that will sit side by side with standard MVPD subscriptions as well as TV everywhere. I think everybody should and will be doing a great deal of experimentation. From a Verizon Digital Media Services perspective, we plan to serve all of it, all of the connected device experience underneath, from the content services through the delivery. And so we're not necessarily taking a bet on what's going to win. We just realize it's a fragmented, chaotic environment for the next few years, and we're planning to serve it all.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree with that, right? That there's going to be, there will be coexistence in these offerings over time. The incumbents in the MSS space have a tremendous competitive advantage just by the fact that they are de facto the incumbent provider of my subscription video service. But I tend to go back to, sort of an Apple frame of mind when it comes into this, which is not, I built this regimented silo and vertically integrated the whole thing and I bounded it off, but rather I built great product and people love it. And that the opportunity over the next 3 years, assuming that we see a rights acquisition structure that shifts a little bit to allow for more sort of the aggregation of more niche and pointed rights for a particular audience, I think that there's massive opportunity for multi-screen innovation over the course of the next 3 years, the development of incredible video product, and that's really how the winner will emerge. And that's going to be a combination of the box, the interface, the subscription offering, the billing system, innovation at the presentation layer in terms of application, and the overall sort of rich content experience. I mean, I keep going back to Zucker's presentation yesterday, which is really that is a telltale sort of a hallmark of what the future might look like around great content products. Yeah. The dynamics around the business models to support that, those are really where we're going to get sorted out in the wake of this over the next year and a half.
Good point.
Yeah, I think that are they binary? No, I don't think they're binary. I think that consumer will drive what ultimately gets adopted. If you do not provide the content that consumers want to consume, then they're going to find another way to get it. I think the real opportunity is in tying the two things together, because not everybody can get the rights to all content. Everybody's got their own specific point of access and their own deals and haven't been able to negotiate these things. So you need from a consumer's perspective, they want it all, and they want it all cheap, and they want it anywhere they want it, and all those kinds of things. And the more of it you can conduit through your service, the better off you're going to be in the long run. I think that it all comes down to access and usability and those kinds of metrics. If you're in a place that Verizon, that networks don't serve properly, I think that you're going to have a very different experience. I think you're going to want to download things in the background and watch them when you want to watch them. If you're in a place that's highly connected, then the opportunity for you, and you have more choice, you're going to choose that which serves you best because it's got the content that you want. The opportunity that the MPVD, the locals have, is that they can aggregate your value-added services and your other wireless services all together and offer you a more bundled package. But if they fail to incorporate the rest of the content offering, then the consumer is going to be left with no other choice but to try to go around it and try to find another solution. I don't think it's a win-lose scenario. I think the opportunity is win confusion.
Rick, you had the last word, and the audience agreed with you. I think in one of those surveys, most people thought that OTT and TVE were not, in fact, mutually exclusive. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to see if the audience members have any question for the panelist, and there's a gentleman coming to you with a microphone. If you would state your name and where you're from.
Sure, I'm Matt Riley. I'm from Los Angeles. One of my favorite apps on the Xbox lately is the ESPN app. And I have Verizon Fios, and it lets me watch OTT content, but only because I'm a subscriber to the Fios video package. Do you see that proliferating, and do you see a new model emerging where the service provider, instead of actually delivering the video content, is really just a clearinghouse for the conditional access rights?
Well, I think there's a variety of ways that they're going to test out exclusivity and different kind of windowing. I mean, sure, I think that will continue. That exact form of access availability, I'm not sure, but I'm a DirecTV subscriber because Fios is not in my neighborhood in Los Angeles, and I love Friday Night Lights, I love Damages, and I get those 6 months before all my friends. And so it's not a unique proposition to tie content. Comcast has been very aggressive with regional sports. It's not that different to try to create loyalists within your subscriber base. But I can't speak specifically to that not being on the Fios side of the house.
I would think that from the work that we do with both the content programmers as well as the MVPDs, it's reasonable to expect that authentication model is the more likely dominant. I mean, the money on the table is just so big that to go and fundamentally disrupt that today would be difficult. That said, one of the opportunities for programmers is if I happen to have some sort of happy animal channel that I, have really differentiated in the marketplace, people are going to come to me on the web or through an application to get more happy animal content. The opportunity for me is to be able to both validate and reinforce the value of that pay TV relationship, right? My sub relationship through an MVPD as happy animal TV, but also at the same time be able to do some things at the presentation there around advertising, around monetization, around microtransactions, around rich content that reinforces the value of my brand independent of that MSO relationship. And that really is what we're seeing through all of our work doing Auth stuff in the TV Everywhere space, is a desire to get to that place. And then phase 2 is make it transactional so that Happy Animal TV can be able to go and segment tiers of their content offering inside the MSO relationship, and then be able to have an upsell on the tiering of my subscriber relationship take place through an interface that's on the Happy Animal side, right? So that both, the tide rises both boats.
Additional questions?
Yeah, John Reister from the Aris Group. I'm curious, when we look at the audio world, the revenues, the amount of money for the recording industry over the last, since iTunes basically, the amount of total aggregate money has plummeted, although their cost from printing CDs has probably dropped a bit as well. And I'm wondering, although probably not a net win there, I'm wondering if we look at the service provider, the operators, the MVPDs perspective over the next 3 years, is there more money for them or less going forward as we start to see, alternative TV everywhere, over the top alternative delivery schemes?
I think that a lot of people like to pick on audio as an example of something that hasn't found a proper monetization framework. It's failed because of all these scary reasons. I would point at ebooks, which are infinitely smaller and lighter in context, and the access that Amazon has created and the success that it's had on all fronts. They're still arguing over who's going to get all the money, but you can't deny that it's wildly successful, and because what they've been very successful in doing is creating a channel of access for that content, seeding the market with devices and an experience that allows the WhisperNet allows instant access to a book within seconds, lying on the beach. Those kinds of things cater directly to what the consumer is asking for, and on the back of that, they've slowly been able to raise the price of ebooks, and nobody's complaining.
And users buy multiples of what they used to.
Yeah, we have 4 of them in our house, right? I'm
but not just the
video
device.
guy.
Per annum, people are buying many more books.
Oh yeah, many more books. My daughter is she's 9.5 years old, and she's got 70 books on her device. Wow. Right? It's crazy how many books she's read. It's just absolutely amazing. So, I would instead of looking at what's happened with the audio industry, I would point to the ebook industry and say, there's your opportunity. You've got validated content. People want it because they're going through all the hassle of downloading it around you. So figure out a way to get it. What they really want is access. Figure out a way to answer your question, to draw the lines in the sand in a way that compromises, the compromise that allows everybody, as Andrew said, to make money in the equation, and it will be wildly successful, right? There is the dots are there, connect them.
Right.
It's not that big of a challenge.
Right. And what I think is very interesting about that example is it wasn't a race to the bottom on the price. They maintained a fairly healthy price, although the value was still apparent to the user. You got instant access, you have great usability, and you also got a price discount versus going into a bookstore. But it wasn't a race to the bottom. They didn't discount it by 95%. They might have discounted it by 20%. So you see the value in the purchase, but it wasn't a race to the bottom. And so the money really was, the pricing strategy was very smart, as well as the usability strategy.
Also access, rolling out books in hardcover and ebook at the same time has given it a parity and viability. And then customers don't have to go, I got to run down to the, put some pants on, run down to the store and buy it because it came out today. I can just grab WhisperNet and say, go.
There's another image. Let me ask one last time if there are any more questions. Yes?
Yes, this is Danny Gold with Levels Beyond, based out of Denver, Colorado. As we start talking about and exploring new ways to monetize content, whether it's interactive advertising, some of the microtransactions we're talking about. How do you see technology companies and all this fragmentation bridging the gap between playback devices, playback networks, subscription models, where you're really engaged direct with the consumer and driving analytics and data back to the programmers and the content creators so that they know what to create that the consumers want to consume? It seems like there's a big divide where they're creating one piece of content, it's going out, they may not even understand all the ways it's being consumed. How do we, without sending spreadsheets around through all eternity, get data and analytics back? How do we make that turn full circle?
You could use our media analytics platform. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. But I mean, no, for us, we have seen as we started to roll out some pretty rich analytics that, soap opera ad sensitivity on a tablet is different than soap opera ad sensitivity in a flash player on a laptop versus, sports across those same individual platforms, right? So the idea of who owns that data so that it can inform editorial decisions is generally it's the content provider, right, who's utilizing some analytic service to be able to go and deliver that, to acquire that data around user behavior, around quality experience, quality service. The idea of me mapping editorial content decisions based on, how audience dropped. I use this example all the time that, like, when Newman would walk into a Seinfeld episode, if you saw 3/4 of your audience drop off at every episode there for at least 2.5 minutes until that scene was over, would Newman still have a job? Right? So that the frightening aspect that you're going to start to make content decisions based on that sort of real-time analytic feedback is an interesting concept and one that is batted around within the programmers fairly regularly. As someone who really believes in narrative and the autonomy of a content creator, I tend to say that would undermine risk over time and sort of compromise a lot of the high-quality content experiences that have come to form our cultural currency, right? So I'd take a more liberal arts approach to that one.
Newman. All right, we've run over a bit, I hope for good reason. I want to thank all of you, our audience in particular, for staying inside the paywall, and for our panelists for their most excellent thoughts and perspective. Please join me in thanking them.